Good afternoon. Today is Wednesday, the 8th of August 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, and myself, Brian Gerrish. Censorship.
Censorship, yes. We're going to get straight in with censorship because here we are, another day, but following on from yesterday's stuff on Alex Jones being banned from Facebook and YouTube and certainly limited on Apple, iTunes and Spotify. I just want to throw out a suggestion as to what might be going on here, Brian, because there's clearly something in the works. This was a pretty coordinated attack, if we could call it that, from the social media companies. Apologies, because of course there's been one doorway left open to them, and that is Twitter, and of course Periscope, which is Twitter's video platform. Now, the New York Times pretty unhappy with that situation, it seemed. They pushed up this poll yesterday calling for Twitter to ban InfoWars. And unfortunately for the New York Times and the mainstream media, that vote seemed to have gone against them with, 78% voting that InfoWars should not be banned from Twitter. But nonetheless, there's still one mainstream social media network that is permitting Alex Jones to continue to talk. And of course, the whole censorship thing being pushed in the mainstream media. And my question is, what effect does this have? I'm suggesting here that perhaps this drives people towards InfoWars, and maybe the mainstream media would argue that in the process they are being radicalized, in inverted commas, on the right of the debate, on the right of the political spectrum. And in parallel with that, of course, we have Syrians, battle-hardened jihadis coming back to the UK, not being prosecuted on their return. So people being wound up in this direction as well by the mainstream media again. So this is driving more people in the direction of Alex Jones and Tommy Robinson, perhaps. And before you know it, we have support for a new right-wing party, and this was your slide from a couple of weeks ago, Brian. Times article, Tory turmoil could lead to a far-right revival. Well, of course, this far-right revival, if we want to call it that, seems to me to be being driven here, but we move on because of course, it's not just censorship and Alex Jones that is, and the other people that have been banned that is the problem here, because we even have mainstream media or mainstream politicians getting involved, again reinforced by mainstream media. This is many of the front pages from today, all aimed directly at Boris Johnson for his comments about the burqa, where he said basically he didn't understand why women wanted to walk around looking like post boxes. So that has instilled a reaction from various people across the political spectrum, including Theresa May. But this is being, again, promoted by the mainstream media. And the question in my mind is, what effect does this have in terms of public opinion and public perception and where people move to on the political spectrum? And of course, if we add into the mix here Brexit, where we have already had an announcement that the Department for Exiting the European Union is discussing cancelling police leave for 2 months in March next year in case there's a no deal on the Brexit negotiations. So what do we have setting itself up here, Brian? That's the question that I have in mind. And I'll say that, as we'll come on to in a second, this is not just about driving people towards the right wing of the political spectrum, because people on the left are also on the receiving end of the censorship. And although they're not getting quite the same coverage in the mainstream media at the moment, this looks to me like something which is designed to drive people towards the extremes and set them against each other.
I would agree with that completely. We've been watching this for some time. I'll just come back to that statement by the Conservative MP Nick Bowles, and also it was repeated by Danny Kruger. We're going back about 4 years now, I think, but they made these comments publicly. Danny Kruger ultimately censured by the Conservative Party, but he said that the Tories intended to bring in a period of what they called creative destruction in public services. And the purpose of that creative destruction was to destabilise, to create chaos so that a new political order could be brought in. That's what the two men said publicly. And of course, everywhere we look at the moment, we can see it, be it in the armed forces, increasingly chaotic. We can't even build ships that work anymore. We've got it in the NHS, we've got it in education. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're now seeing this moving across into politics. We've now got massive turmoil inside the Labour Party, the anti-Semitic label being hurled at Mr. Corbyn. Inside the Tories, we can see that everything is there for a breakdown of the Tories as they gang up on Theresa May. Why do you want chaos in the country? Because while the public are concerned with that chaos, they can't see the pieces of the deep state political jigsaw going together. And the icing on the cake, of course, is for the state to be able to introduce violence, because if you can start violence on the streets between left and right, for instance, that means that you can bring in all of those draconian powers to limit free speech further, to limit people gathering, to limit people challenging the government. So there's a model here, I think, being built very quickly. My prediction is we're going to see the formulation of left and right. The BBC is going to be working on this, we can be sure. And we're going to see breakdown in politics. What do they want? The formation of a centrist party, which will be the party, literally a single party state. You're there.
Well, who are Facebook working with? Well, this Reuters report here, headline is US think tank's tiny lab helps Facebook battle fake social media. Well, this, in fact, a story goes back to May this year, where Facebook announced that it was partnering with the Atlantic Council, which of course absolutely rabidly anti-Russia and pro the various regime change operations linked to NATO, of course. And they said that this was to combat election-related propaganda and misinformation from proliferating on Facebook. Well, Reuters here reporting that Facebook has now become a top donor to the Atlantic Council. So the Atlantic Council receiving money from Facebook as well as from Western governments, NATO itself, Gulf regimes, and various branches of the US military, and also some corporations, defense contractors, military industrial complex sort of thing. Facebook says that they're using the Atlantic Council to enhance investigations of foreign interference. And they said that they've taken down 32 suspicious pages and accounts that purport to be run by leftists and minority activists, while some US officials said they were likely the work of Russian agents. Facebook said it did not know for sure. So Facebook doesn't know what these pages are. They seem to be left-leaning pages and possibly the work of Russian agents, they say. But in fact, they don't know, but they took them down anyway. That's a good position to take.
The whole thing is opaque, Mike, isn't it? Because we've got these companies, we'll say Google, Facebook, Twitter, whoever it is, supposedly providing a service to the public, but they're now becoming increasingly integrated within government structures and security structures. So you've no idea who you're really dealing with. And if you got to the stage where, as we have with David Cameron, one of his chosen godparents was from Google. I think I've got the right one. You can check that up
for his children.
For his children, yeah. We've got a sort of incestuous relationship between government and these very companies. What we need is more transparency on what they're actually doing. What is occurring is less transparency. Well, let's move on to this little item, which is of interest. We'll say that at the moment, but an eagle-eyed person spotted this little public notice on a lamppost. This is Worcestershire County Council. If we blow it up, we can probably see a bit more. It's a public notice, Road Traffic Regulation Act 1984, and there's roadworks essentially between the A422 Worcester Road and Inkbarrow, where they're putting in place a temporary 10 mile an hour speed limit. So it talks about carriageway resurfacing, and it's not unusual they're putting a speed limit in place. But what caught this people's eye was this: exemptions, special forces vehicles. And this was of interest because, of course, when roadworks go into place, certain vehicles, particularly those that are entitled to carry a blue light, are exempt in any case. But in this case, we have a declared special exemption for special forces. And I'm going to say that the person who sent this through to us found it extremely strange, even though they have connections in areas where they might understand a little bit more whether this was normal or not normal. Now, I did attempt to speak to Worcestershire County Council before the news. Indeed, I had a short conversation with a very nice lady who said she would try and find out more about it. But in the meantime, our viewer has said, is this special restriction or the special release of a restriction in force because there's going to be special forces activity? We don't know. So if anybody else has got further information on that, please let us know. And we'll just add, of course, we could expect that an ambulance, for example, would be able to breach that 10-mile-an-hour limit. So why do we need a special notification for special forces? Just a question. Well, if we look at censorship, really it's alternative media is the only place where the warnings are coming thick and fast that it appears that we have an increasingly draconian clampdown on free speech. And thank you very much to the person who pointed out that Count Dankula, now this is the gentleman, if I got it right, who taught his dog how to do a Nazi salute. Some people might say that was in bad taste. Many people said it was a joke. And as a result, this gentleman has had huge support through the courts. But he'd put in an appeal, and he'd made this little video clip to say that his appeal had been rejected. Now, what caught our eye was that in the video clip, he starts talking about this document in which he says, quite correctly, that we have judges attempting a further clampdown on free speech and certainly free opinion. So if I bring that up on screen and see whether I can read through a little bit of it for you. But essentially, I think this is one of the judges talking. But they say this: likewise, the appeal against sentence is not arguable. This was a deeply unpleasant offence in which disgraceful and utterly offensive material was very widely distributed by the appellant. This was to the considerable distress of the community in question, and just as disturbingly to the apparent approval of a large number of persons who appear to share the appellant's racist views. Indeed, it must be observed that in the circumstances, the appellant was fortunate that the learned sheriff was not considering custody as an option. I also refer to the sheriff's report at paragraph 83, where he deals with the plea in mitigation. He charitably describes this as unusual. On my reading, it appears to be wholly improper. It involved an attack upon the bona fides of the police and prosecution, an apparent refusal by an officer of the court to accept the verdict to the court, an apparent attempt to intimidate the court in the sentencing process by reference to a publicly funded appeal, expressions of personal views on the outcome by the solicitor, whose professional duty was clearly confined to submissions in fact and law, and an apparently enthusiastic endorsement of the appellant's defiance. For an officer of the court to engage in such behaviour is at best unprofessional and improper, and would certainly merit a professional complaint. Indeed, for my part, I consider the solicitor was fortunate not to himself require representation on the matter of contempt. So there we have judges really making quite a, in my opinion, threatening statement to a solicitor who dared show that not only was he supporting the defendant, but he actually agreed with the case that the defendant was presenting. This is well within the Star Chamber route, Mike, that it doesn't matter whether it's supposed to be a court. The judge is the person there who is going to say exactly what happens. We've seen in England judges effectively directing juries, which should be unlawful, but that appeared to be the case. And now if you're in the legal profession and you dare show that you have an opinion, you're going to be suppressed, except where it appears we can have, for example, the head of the family law division giving opinion on future laws and still remaining independent to the actual court that they're serving. So this was brought up quite rightly as another indication that the courts, judges deem themselves to become even more powerful, and woe betide anybody who expresses an opinion supporting the views of a defendant.
The whole censorship issue that we were talking about earlier, one of the effects of that, as we've mentioned, is likely to be the sort of breakup of communities on the internet. So people moving away from Facebook into siloed websites and so on. Well, there's a sort of parallel situation going on here, which is the result of the EU's data protection rules as a result of the new legislation, the GDPR. Many may have noticed that if you're trying to look at US-based media outlets, mainstream media outlets at the moment, many of them are inaccessible from the UK or from the European Union, in fact, because of the GDPR. Well, this website here, verifiedjoseph.com, has published a list of the websites not available in the EU from the United States because of GDPR. And I'm going to scroll down through this list in a second. You're not going to be able to, it's going to scroll pretty quickly. You're not going to be able to see the names, but if we just scroll through this, you get an impression of the number of websites that are actually currently not available in the UK as a result of GDPR. So on May 25th, 2018, they say the European Union's new General Data Protection Regulation came into force. This resulted in organizations, mainly US-based newspapers, blocking people living in the European Union and European Economic Area from accessing their websites. This data set lists websites that are or were blocked, along with links to archived versions of the websites and archived block messages. The data set is incomplete. Well, I imagine it would be because there's a huge number of websites on this list already. And really, Brian, what I think we're looking at is effectively the balkanization of the internet. So huge sections of the internet not available to certain other countries on the same internet. Well, some people would say, well, why don't you just use a VPN, a virtual private network, to access that stuff? And of course you absolutely can, but that's not the point. What we have here is a piece of legislation which the websites in question consider so onerous that they simply have decided to switch off access from people from the jurisdiction that legislation has come from. I think this is a pretty bad precedent. While many people would say that the GDPR is having positive effects in many areas, I think this is one area. There hasn't been no discussion about this, and it should be an area that needs discussion.
A lot of discussion. So we can see a march to closing down free speech. There's no question of this. Secret courts, public denied access to courts, more courts with just a jury. And on the other hand, you've got to make sure that the public doesn't have access to information through the internet. The internet is really Tony Blair's mistake, isn't it? Because Tony Blair said, what did he regret? And that was the Freedom of Information Act, because it allowed people to look inside government. That's exactly what the web is doing. They don't want that to happen. So it's now got to be broken up and compartmentalized.
Right. Well, this is the 10th anniversary of the South Ossetian War. This is the war between, this is the war which began with Georgia attacking South Ossetia, which was an autonomous region. And Russia, of course, went to the defense of the locals who asked for their help. This started a bit of a war between Russia and Georgia, and a number of deaths as a result. TASS here reporting that South Ossetia has been holding mourning events marking the anniversary of the 2008 war. They're saying that participants pay tribute to those killed by laying flowers to the memorial places. and also literature and musical events were organised, and the Republic's churches held prayer services overnight on August 2008. This day in August 2008, Georgia carried out an armed aggression, TASS says, against its former autonomous region, South Ossetia. Russia defended the civilians and its peacekeepers who had been on duty in the region since 1992. The 5-day war claimed more than 1,000 lives. On August 26, 2008, Russia recognized South Ossetia's independence. Well, this morning, BBC Radio 4 Today programme had Mikheil Saakashvili on the programme. Of course, he was the president of Georgia at the time of the South Ossetian War. Now, he is not only no longer president of Georgia, but has been stripped of his citizenship of Georgia, and in fact is wanted on many crimes in that country at the moment. Saakashvili himself was a Soros man. He was put in power to fulfill the wishes of his paymasters. But once he had decided to leave Georgia, Uncle George, Soros that is, found himself a new position in the Ukraine, where he became governor of Odessa. But unfortunately, that didn't go too well for him either. He was stripped of his Ukrainian citizenship. He's currently a stateless person and in exile in the Netherlands. So as I say, this morning, the BBC interviewed him on the Today programme. And I wonder if we can guess if the BBC presenter, that's Nick Robinson, mentioned any of these facts. But let's have a listen to what he said.
The president of Georgia at the time of the invasion was Mikheil Saakashvili. He's written that the West was weak in its response and now looks weak again in the face of what he calls Vladimir Putin's aggression. Mr. Saakashvili, good morning to you.
Very good morning to you.
As you listen back to that archive of the war 10 years ago, did you imagine for a second then that Russia would still now be occupying large parts of your country?
His country? So Nick Robinson just said that it was his country. Well, I don't think it was. It is his country. So the BBC went to Saakashvili for comment about a war that he started and didn't put any of the context of his history, his recent history, into the introduction or into the conversation with Saakashvili. They then give him free rein to spout anti-Russian rhetoric unchallenged. I think we've got to say well done to the BBC. Russian military drills, apparently, which are taking place at the moment, are now threatening war with Georgia once again. I think this is being engineered, and the BBC helping quite nicely with that, Brian.
It's outrageous. I think, really, Mike, the BBC has lost all credibility. I think as we look at the news today, the BBC news, I mean in general today, over the recent weeks and months, the BBC is simply just not viable anymore. It is a propaganda machine. Of course, it's £3.74 billion paid for by the British public. But what is the BBC's agenda? It's propaganda for the British government, of which regime change is a key part of it. And it doesn't matter whether that's in Libya or Syria or Iraq or now moving into Eastern Europe. What we're seeing is the engineered breakdown of these countries in order to produce regime change and a puppet government which is subordinate to the requirements of the Western world.
Well, in the meantime, Graham Phillips, independent journalist, formerly with RT for a short time, but independent at the moment, has got himself into a little bit of trouble today because there was an exhibition being held to mark the 10th anniversary of the events of August 2008, and that was taking place in the Georgian embassy in London. And he has apparently managed to get himself into that and made his feelings clear by shouting what are being described as anti-Georgian and anti-NATO, or making anti-Georgian and anti-NATO remarks. So rather than just asking him to leave, he had the diplomatic police called on him and he was arrested this morning. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia, according to this report, has said that he has been detained without having given his name, He, without permission, disrupted the exhibition, loudly shouted slogans against NATO and accused Georgia of providing incorrect information for the British audience. I would imagine that he was absolutely correct in what he said, but I'm not certain what his status is at the moment, but he certainly was arrested and removed this morning. Okay, what's next? Oh, well, an accident. Brian, a misfire, NATO misfire. So this was in Estonia, where there was another NATO exercise taking place, and a Spanish Air Force Eurofighter, which is Typhoon, has, accidentally, they say, fired a live missile while conducting drills. This took place yesterday. The Estonian military says it's looking for the remains of the missile. Apparently, some kind of self-destruct was activated, and the jet continued flying. But apparently, the Spanish have been blocked or banned from flying and taking any further part in this exercise. And the Estonian Prime Minister said, "Thank God, no human casualties. It was extremely regrettable." He's ordered a suspension of all military sorties by the Spanish until the situation is resolved, and their role in the exercises has been taken up by the Portuguese instead. So there you go. The exercise, however, will continue.
Yeah, I think my comment on this one, Mike, is these sorts of accidents do happen. Obviously, they're immensely dangerous if they do happen, but they're even more dangerous if you've got potentially hostile, you're in proximity of potentially hostile forces. So this is the danger of all these big NATO exercises right up on the border, that you get something go wrong and the next minute there's no room for error. So these sorts of accidents do occasionally happen. They will happen to the Russians as much as they do to NATO. But the point is, if you've got Russian and NATO forces in close proximity, these sorts of mistakes could be absolutely deadly. Well, let's return back to UK. And as we promised yesterday, we said we'd report more on the Melanie Shaw Leeds case. Melanie Shaw, the Beechwood child abuse whistleblower, who spent over 2 years now in British prisons, most of that time in solitary confinement. Remember that United Nations says very clearly that to put people in solitary confinement is torture, but the British government is prepared to do that with a child abuse survivor, suffering from PTSD, amongst other problems. So Melanie appeared in court yesterday. About 30 people attended, and we're going to say thank you very much for all of the reports that have come forward from people who did attend. We picked out this little video clip this morning. We were going to show you part of it because we thought it was so good. It was by a gentleman who calls himself blogs as Simon Sideways, real name Tim Fall. He put out an excellent clip together. We were just listening to it and selecting what would be a good excerpt. And all of a sudden the clip has gone down. Now it says the user has taken the clip down. We don't know why it's gone. Hopefully it will be back up because he gives such a comprehensive report of the trial. Luckily we had managed to hear it from start to finish. I've just pulled out a couple of points that he makes. This is a key one that many people have commented on. Melanie was late, and when she got to the court, she was actually incoherent. Now, Melanie has simply not turned up at previous hearings as a result of unknown decisions made at her prison, HMP style. So this is either incompetence by the prison, or they simply don't care that there's a program running in the courts, or something else was happening, which we'll come on to in a minute. Now, he points out that on the 2nd of August, Melanie was deemed by a court psychologist to be fit to plead. Yet yesterday, on the 9th, yesterday, sorry, have I got the date right there? The 9th of August, she's rambling and clearly...
the 7th of August.
Sorry,
yesterday.
the 7th, that should be the 7th of August. She is rambling and clearly unfit to plead. So this is very strange that a psychologist says she's okay, and yet a few days later she's not okay. But what we can also say is we are aware that psychologist or psychiatrist for Melanie was prevented from getting into the prison. The hearing was evil. This is where he gets to in his analysis. He's almost lost for words because clearly this hearing upset so many people. So he says the hearing was evil, and it shows the extent to which the establishment will go to cover up. And we've also got here that many of the people who attended, and as I say, we believe it was approximately 30 people, but many were very disturbed by what they saw and heard, and they came out effectively, they couldn't believe it. And the comment was that one man came in believing the BBC, i.e. believing that the BBC tells the truth, and he came out in disbelief at what he'd experienced in that court. His world had changed. And what are the people describing? They're talking about the brutal treatment of an immensely vulnerable child abuse survivor in a British court. This is the real state of the United Kingdom under Theresa May's Conservative government, and that's the same government that is lecturing other countries overseas on how to conduct their own countries.
Right, just before you move on, Alex has said that he has put the replacement video up now on his channel, and it's called Melanie Shaw, Unbelievable Truth.
Okay, well, that's really excellent. We have not seen that replacement video, but we'll encourage people to go on the basis that his first shot of reporting what happened in the court was so good. Now, we did get other reports. We've chosen to go with a report that came in from Robert Green, and let's have a look at what Robert Green has to say. He says, first of all, Melanie Shaw was drugged. That was the general opinion of those of us present. At the onset, before Melanie arrived, HMP Style were about 90 minutes late. The judge informed us that on the 2nd of August, Professor Jennifer Shaw had passed Melanie as being fit to plead, so that the trial could go ahead without further ado. Once Defence Counsel had been given the opportunity to speak to her, counsel having told the court that he had never been able to speak to his client before. So here we've got the Defence Counsel calmly telling the court that he hadn't at that stage been able to speak to his client. We believe this is because Melanie's counsel was blocked from seeing her in HMP Style. Let's continue. When Melanie finally appeared, she was completely incoherent to the extent she did not even understand the please question put to her by the clerk. Astonishingly, Defence Counsel had not forewarned the judge about her truly shocking condition, although he had only just been speaking to her. I made the point to counsel that as she'd been confirmed on the 2nd of August to be competent by an expert, how could her condition have possibly deteriorated so rapidly within 5 days? I believe that the most likely possibility was that HMP Style staff had either administered drugs to affect her or had denied her the medication she needed. I emphasised that there were grounds to suggest that a criminal offence had been committed by a person or persons as yet unknown from HMP Style. Both the judge and the Defence Counsel should have called in an appropriate medical specialist without delay to examine Melanie. I believe that both could reasonably be accused of failing in their duty of care to her. Later, during the summing up, when it was finally decided that the trial could not possibly go ahead, Judge Phillips stated that without access to expert opinion, he did not know if Melanie was indeed unfit to plead or if her conduct was willful. If the judge feels that the latter is a possibility, then he must also accept the possibility of a deliberate attempt by a person or persons unknown to damage Melanie's mental capability, at least in the short term. Judge Phillips made no mention of this obvious possibility and thus, in my view, failed to act in the best interests of Melanie and of justice itself. That is my firm view of today's inhuman debacle. So this is very, very strong comment that's coming out of people who attended court, people who were utterly disgusted at the way a British court has again treated this very, very important and very, very vulnerable child abuse witness. And of course, Melanie Shaw is the same child abuse witness whom the independent child abuse inquiry refuses to contact, refuses to take information on the basis that she has to contact them. However, since the prison censors Melanie's letters and telephone calls, Melanie has consistently been unable to get in contact with the child abuse inquiry. So we've got a circle here, Mike, which is becoming ever clearer. This is the circle where the victim is victimised further, and of course her testimony is covered up to most likely protect the abusers in the Westminster and establishment higher circles. Now there's another piece to this case. We're not sure what to make of this at the moment, but in some of the reports from people in court, and this has now reached social media, people are saying that it appeared that Miss Melanie was missing fingers or missing parts of fingers. Now we understand that reference was made to a broken arm. We think that was Melanie herself when she left court in an immensely distressed state, but she'd got bandaged, possibly plastered fingers, and people said they believed that the tips of her fingers were missing. Now, we have no idea of the accuracy of these reports, but what we do know is that over the years that Melanie has been in prison, she's consistently talked about the brutal treatment, including assaults on her and other forms of effectively torture, sensory deprivation. We don't know what could have taken place to her in the prison. Well, the BBC has kept its record by not reporting on Melanie Shaw. Remember, all of the information about Beechwood Children's Home, Nottingham, has disappeared from the Nottingham Post website. It's disappeared from the BBC. So Melanie Shaw and Beechwood is now airbrushed out of the wider public media. What's the BBC talking about? Well, they're very happy because they've managed to find a German couple which in a very unpleasant case were first of all abusing their own son and then sold him to other paedophiles. So a very dark court case in Germany where these parents have been abusing their children. What is the BBC doing here? Well, of course, it's laying a false trail that the paedophiles are in other countries. They're at the lower end of British society. What the BBC is consistently doing is focusing people's attention in other directions from high-level paedophile rings in this country. But it got better because on this same page from the BBC website, we'd got a special feature. Let's bring in the feature. Here it is. I was kidnapped in London and trafficked for sex. And what's the topic here? Well, the topic is that a girl was kidnapped by Romanian abusers, prostituted and trafficked. I've no doubt this story is true. It is harrowing, it is horrific. But what the BBC has managed to do yet again is draw the British public's attention away to problems with other nationalities. In the top line, I've struck through Asians because we're not talking Asians now, we're talking Romanians. What the BBC won't talk about is the controlling hand which is within the Westminster political elite. And I followed this through. I always like to see who's shown in the article. So if you wanted to find out more about this particular story, you're able to visit the BBC World Service, and this lady Jo Fidgen is apparently effectively the contact lady there. The BBC repeats the usual mantra, which they recommend all of the usual suspects as people for victims to go to for help: the police, Crime Stoppers, NSPCC. All of those organisations certainly are organisations which victims have been telling us for years they would not trust or touch with a barge pole. I did speak to the Modern Slavery Helpline, and that was quite interesting. I'm going to speak to them again later today to see whether they can possibly give Melanie Shaw some help. But with regard to the BBC, it's the same names being pushed forward. And the main story itself came from this lady, Sarah McDermott. Here it is, the harrowing story of a young Romanian woman who'd come to London with dreams of a better life, but who was abducted, forced into controlled prostitution, and endured unimaginable cruelty. How is it that the BBC can write about this Romanian lady, but they cannot write about Melanie Shaw? What could possibly be the difference between the two? Is it that the Romanian girl does not know how the system works in UK, and Melanie Shaw does know that for the system to work in UK, British politicians have either got to be involved in the abuse and or part of the cover-up? I took the opportunity to post on her Twitter page, so if you freeze the screen you can have a look at some of the comments I made, but I pointed out this hypocrisy, and I'm going to encourage people to do this, because it's one thing writing a letter simply blaming the BBC. It's much more powerful to get into a dialogue with the very journalists who've written their material to challenge them why they don't report the real stories. So all in all, we wait now for the 6 weeks or so to find out what is going to happen to Melanie Shaw. But if there's any comfort out of her court case, it's to see that so many more people now realise how serious the situation is in UK, where courts are clearly not doing their job, or we could go a step further and say courts appear to be helping the cover-up process of the abuse of youngsters. Well, we're going to end on a sad note today, because we were informed this morning that a lady called Wendy Hirst had died. Wendy Hirst had been a very, very big campaigner for Melanie Shaw, but also Wendy had worked to help a great many other people who have been abused within the British so-called care system, and it's going to be a sad loss that she's gone. We'd also like to thank her for all of her support, because Wendy was a strong supporter of the UK column for a great many years, and well, we'd like to recognise that contribution. And finally,
well, just before we move on to that, we should mention that we do have details of Guy Taylor's funeral arrangements, and we will be mentioning those on the programme tomorrow. So if you'd like to attend Guy's funeral, we'll have the details for you tomorrow. Okay,
thank you for that. And final comment on Melanie, we still have these excellent postcards available at the UK column. You can find these on the UK column website, but what a brilliant way to get a very clear message across to people. And of course, while this postcard is in transit, people are able to read it, the postman sees it, but we need to do something about what's happening in UK. We've got a government now beginning to suppress alternative media. We can see the clampdown on free speech. We can see the political meddling amongst any group that dares to challenge the government. And of course, what does the government need to protect above everything else? It's its record over child abuse. So that's where we need to get the lid off. That's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.